and he's got a series of books called The Explorer Race. And unlike your work, which is grounded and rooted in artifacts and ancient archaeology, his material is is much more I would say it's more multidimensional, but it falls into that channeling realm. And I'm generally not a big fan of that, but I discovered his work back in the 90s. And there's a book called Shining the Light. And in Shining the Light, he doesn't talk about the Anunnaki. He actually, this is the channeled entity talking through Shapiro. But he talks about how there is an outpost in South Africa. And the outpost of South Africa is related to Atlantis. So these were a group of Atlanteans that were living in South Africa, and when Atlantis collapses into the water, which theoretically could be a flood or a manifestation of the flood, this group of people decide that they need help. And what they do is they reach out to the first king / ruler of Atlantis, philosopher, king, ruler, which according to this source is Lucifer, a fallen angel, part Orion, part Syrian. And from that point, the Orions come to South Africa, and they work with this group of people in South Africa and help them. But what happens is, according to this work, is they hide their DNA off. That's number one. The second piece is they create what's called the caretaker race. And the caretaker race is the race of folks that are basically the group that you're talking about, the high priests, the ruling class, the royal bloodlines, the royal families. But I found it interesting that it was all in South Africa, and I just filed that away. And then when I discovered you, excuse me, in your work through Janet, not very long ago, I found the two pieces coming together to be interesting. Now the terminology and the races are obviously different here, but nonetheless there is still kind of a common theme with that area. And he came to this without any of the physical evidence that you came to. So I'm curious, in your world, where does Atlantis play as far as being related to the findings that you've been exploring in the Anunnaki in South Africa?
Well, I think the important common denominator there is what you mentioned is the Orions, because in African culture, Orion is suddenly playing a very important role, because we discovered that Adam's calendar, or Enki's calendar as we call it now, is linked to the rise of Orion's belt. And we have a very distinct link to that, not only Orion, but also the Horus bird. And the Horus bird that greets the rising sun on the spring equinox in the southern hemisphere, looking at the three stones and stars of Orion, pointing to the skies, telling us whence we come from, I guess, or something like that, or giving us some sort of information. The link to the Atlanteans I find is a very interesting one, because what I discovered is that these ancient civilizations that were mining gold there used energy, used sound frequency as a source of energy, and there's absolutely no doubt about that, because we're not just speculating about this anymore. We found the tools and we found the measurements in the stone circles that are still alive and active today. They're still giving us frequency at 14.5 gigahertz at 72 decibels that is alive and active, and we can utilize it once we figure out how to tap into that frequency and convert it to all kinds of different applications. What is interesting is that the structures that they built to generate this energy, the stone structures, resemble in very great detail what we call today magnetrons. A magnetron, which is a high-frequency, high-energy generating device we use in laser beams and in microwaves, and the death ray that Nikola Tesla and the Japanese then later stole from him, or you borrowed from him, should I say. What I'm trying to say is that these ancient cultures used the same kind of structures a long, long time ago to generate energy, tapping into planet Earth, generating huge amounts of energy. And I was recently told by a psychic woman in Johannesburg that the same structures that were used by these ancient cultures in southern Africa to generate energy were misused and abused in Atlantis to generate extremely high amounts of energy, which actually was the cause for the sinking or the destruction of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting link for me, and the most immediate link that I have.
Right. Well, let's talk about some of these structures. Physically, do you fly over parts of South Africa and are able to see them, or how did you unearth some of these structures that you're referring to?
Well, the guy that actually started bringing them to our attention is Johann Heine. Johann he's in the firefighting business, forestry firefighting business, and for 20 odd years or more, he was flying over all these forestry areas and the areas in southern Africa, and realizing that, seeing these circular stone structures, and he started photographing them, and he compiled a large number of a few thousands of photographs of these stone structures, many of which are on tops of mountains, strangely enough, and that was a curious thing that we had to deal with for a while to figure out why are the ones on tops of mountains exposed, and there seems to be less further down. And then Johann tried to bring this to the attention of the authorities in South Africa and the universities and archaeologists, and he kept on being told that, stop wasting our time. These are just, Bantu and cattle kraal and Bantu structures from just a few hundred years ago, and they have little historic value and stuff like that. And then, fortunately, Johann didn't take that as a serious answer from them, and he started analyzing their structure and realized that these things are aligned with the rise of the sun and the equinoxes and the solstices and very advanced knowledge of sacred geometry that is encoded in their structure and so forth. And then in 2003, he discovered, or should I say rediscovered, what I then later called Adam's calendar, and started measuring that, and realized that it's perfectly aligned with the cardinal points of planet Earth and all the equinoxes and solstices. Plus, you can measure the entire year, every day of the year, still reasonably accurately with the calendar by the setting of the sun, where the shadow falls when the sun sets on a daily basis. And it goes from solstice to solstice, from summer solstice to winter solstice, and then it turns back, and then there's the shadow that falls on the Adam's calendar rock that tells you exactly where you are in the year. So it's these discoveries that by Johann that brought us together, and we just carried on the work, and about a year or so after I started, working on these stone ruins and these stone structures in Southern Africa, or South Africa especially, I realized that the stones that were used to build these structures had very specific properties, and those properties were that they ring like bells. Mm-hmm. Stones were not just randomly chosen from all the stones lying close by. That's not the case. They were chosen for their acoustic properties, and from that moment on, it was like a roller coaster ride, and the discoveries were just spectacular. That we're dealing with an ancient civilization that understood the frequency, the power of sound, and using the power of sound as an energy source. Yeah,
and I think that's really the key. And that goes back to some of the stuff that Frank Herbert was playing with in Dune, and on Arrakis, where Paul and his tribe were using the power of sound, and they were actually using the power of sound amplified as a weapon. But nonetheless, it's a really interesting piece, and one that I think that ultimately is a huge key for us. Here in this world, and being able to kind of level the playing field, so to speak, for just about everybody. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One, which is not necessarily maybe the question that you would normally get in terms of this work, but more about your life and how it might relate to this work. You were born and raised in South Africa, am I correct?
I was actually born in Europe. I was born in the Czech Republic.
Okay, and how long have you been in South? How long were you in South Africa for?
We arrived in South Africa just after the Russian invasion in 1968.
Okay.
I was a mining engineer in Czechoslovakia at that stage, and he decided he had enough of the Russians and he wanted to get the hell out of there, and he chose for some strange reason he chose South Africa. So I arrived in South Africa as a young boy, and obviously grew up speaking Afrikaans. I went to Afrikaans schools, and pretty much became an Afrikaans cultured individual, if you can call it that. And then when I left school, I grew up on the mines, the gold mines, and then eventually platinum mines.
Mm-hmm.
And so I completely understand the culture and the environment around which the gold mining industries in South Africa operate. And I can tell you something, from my restructuring the gold mining activities in Southern Africa 200,000 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
not much has changed.
Yeah.
And this might come as a shock to people listening to this. Not much has changed. The reason I'm saying this is because when you grow up in the gold mines and you live in these small gold mining towns, okay, everything is provided for the people that work on the mines and live in the mining communities. Everything. Your housing is for free. You get garden services. Everything is for free. All the sporting facilities are for free. Schooling is for free. Some days of the 1 day a week on a Sunday or whatever, you go to the mine club, right, in the center of the mine village, and they give you a free meal and stuff like that. And once a year, all the miners get together and they have what they call a Christmas tree, the Christmas celebration every year on Christmas Day, and they hand out presents, free presents to every single individual and their children on the mine. It is quite spectacular to see what actually goes down and how closely linked it must be to what was probably happening 200, 300,000 years ago with those original mining colonies, where everything circled and focused around the mining of gold and supporting the guys that were doing the mining with enough food, agriculture, housing, comforts, everything that they needed to enable them to do the mining. It's spectacular. Yeah.
Really interesting. Yeah, because that's kind of where I wanted to go with this was, how it relates to modern day South Africa and the conditions and the social conditions, and I think you pretty much nailed that one. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and then when you talk about like the most mysterious ruin in all of Africa, well, other than the Great Pyramid, obviously, or the pyramids, is Great Zimbabwe. The ruins in Zimbabwe of Great Zimbabwe, which I believe absolutely was Enki's house or Enki's main residence in Southern Africa, as in among all the mining colonies. And the reason I say this is jokingly, I always say in my presentations, is when you arrive in a mining town anywhere in South Africa, it's very easy to spot where the mine manager lives. Just look around you and find the biggest hill and find the biggest house on top of that hill.
Right.
That's where the mine manager lives.
Yeah.
And that's what Great Zimbabwe is. It's the big house on the hill. It is the most spectacular and by far the most impressive of any of the stone structures in Southern Africa. And that's where the mine manager lived. And that mine manager's name was Enki.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. To the north of South Africa, a few miles north, more than a few, there's another very interesting creation story or creation myth, and that's the myth of the Dogon and Nomo. And have you done much work connecting on the Anunnaki with the creation myths of the Dogon and the Nomos, and if so, where does it overlap, and where does it not fit?
Well, I've done some work, not enough. I need to do a lot more. But I've been so caught up in what we're discovering that there seems to be not enough time most of the time at this stage. I guess that has to change. But what I can tell you is that there are absolutely very, very strong links to the Dogon people of Mali to the Southern African cultures, and what I believe were the prototype civilizations on Earth of humans in those gold mining colonies, and from there all the human civilizations and groups probably sprung up afterwards, because we find everything, every symbol that you can think of. I'm exaggerating, not everything, but many of the great